Welcome to the Wild Enthusiasm for Living podcast. I am your host, Dr. Melissa Mann. Join me for conversations about possibilities and tools for having more joy, more play, and way more of you. What would it be like to wake up every day with a wild enthusiasm for living? Hello and welcome to the Wild Enthusiasm for Living podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Mann, and I am with my new friend today, Dr. Karen Parker, who is the founder of Quantum Human Design. Welcome, Dr. Karen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I love your opening question. I'm going to borrow that if I can. That's such a great question to start with. So
absolutely. Thank you so much. And that's, my target with this podcast. And it sounds like a lot of your target also is really creating a wild enthusiasm for living and having a experience for yourself, for your clients of self-actualization. And that's part of, I think, why you created Quantum Human Design. So I'd love to dive in. And I am familiar with human design and I am not well versed in it. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, how you got to where you are now, and like what created the spark in you to have a good thing and go, I can make this even better. And yeah, just let us know kind of how that all began.
That is a very long story because I'm very old. So I will try to keep, and if I start with the beginning, it's a very long story. But I think the short version is that I really had a very powerful and I think very unique, not very unique, but a unique experience in that in 1999, I was a mom with 4 young kids living in suburban Houston. And my first husband at the time kind of had a breakdown. He was exhausted and depleted and burned out. I don't think we use that term quite in the same way as we use it now. And I sent him on a spiritual treat to Sedona, Arizona, and he came back with a weird looking chart. and he showed it to me. And when I looked at this thing, I talk about how it just felt like a temple bell went off in my body. And I said, I have got to learn everything about this. I don't know what it is, but I've got to learn everything about it. So we literally put the house on the market and sold it within 2 weeks, packed up the 4 kids, the cats, the dogs, drove from Houston, Texas to Sedona, Arizona, because that was the only headquarters where anybody could study human design at that time. And this was like pre-Zoom. So there wasn't online learning. There wasn't all that stuff that we have now. And so I got to Sedona, and as we arrived in Sedona, my youngest son, who was, I think, 3 at the time, had an ear infection. So I took him to the pediatrician's office. And as I came out of the pediatrician's office with this kid on my hip, across the hallway was a door with that same chart on it. And I was like, well, I'm just going to go in here. So I opened the door, and there was this tiny little woman behind this giant desk. And she said to me, oh, did you come for the job? And I said, yes, I did. And so she hired me there on the spot. And that ended up being the headquarters for Human Design America, which was at the time the only place where you could study human design in America. And I got to work for the founder of the organization and study with him for 5 years. And it was an incredible experience. And the next part of the story is, I'm a nurse by training. As my original degree is in nursing, I have a PhD in integrative health. I've studied energy psychology. I was one of the very first life coaches trained in the world. I've always been obsessed with, why do people do the things they do? And why do people get stuck? And most importantly, what needs to happen to get people unstuck? We have a lot of theories and philosophies and ways of coaching people around stuckness. And honestly, getting unstuck is hard. Right? We are physiologically hardwired to be stuck. Our bodies are very consistent, very efficient. Our brain is very efficient. And when we get stuck, it takes a lot to leverage ourselves out of the ruts that we get in. And we're not always successful. And that has just always been my very, very big question. What do we do to get people unstuck? And one of the things that I noticed about 5 years into my journey of studying human design, which, by the way, human design is a personality assessment system. It's based on Eastern and Western astrology, the Chinese I Ching, the Hindu chakra system, Judaic Kabbalah, and quantum physics. And while it sounds really metaphysical and woo-woo, really the way that I like to think of it, it's a way of looking at your personality through the lens of ancient and modern archetypes. In other words, it's a way of looking at your story and really exploring ancient and modern archetypes through the lens of your personal narrative. And that's always how I've used it. I've always seen it as this very elegant, very systematic way of exploring what story am I telling about myself, and how is that story impacting my interpretation of the world around me? How's that story affecting my money, my relationships, my body, my health, even my spirituality, my spiritual connection? And so when I start, at about 5 years into my human design journey, I started to feel like it wasn't enough.
Mm.
It was a really great tool to get people back into an exploration of who am I not, which is a very important question in the beginning of our journey, right? We have to understand, okay, who am I not? Because so many times in the process of cultivating our own story, so much of what we take in and so much of what we include in our story is stuff that we've picked up from the world around us. And this is pre-epigenetics days. So we didn't even have epigenetics in those days. So now we know that some of the story you tell about who you are is based on ancestral memory. Some of it's based on your imprinting from your family. Some of it's based on your interpretation of your lived experiences, the things your teacher said, the things that happened to you. And some of it is based on societal and familial expectations, things we learned to do to stay safe or to stay loved or to stay valued or to be successful in the world. And human design gave us a very good way to go, okay, I'm not those things. But to me, it really stopped short.
Yeah.
It didn't go to the next step with, okay, if I'm not this, then who am I?
Mm.
And when we're talking about personal narrative, and we know now, especially from some of the more modern research in narrative psychology, your story is organizing your nervous system. It's influencing how you see and perceive the world. It's either creating a state of coherence and wholeness within your body, or it's creating a state of stress or fight or flight. Your story is really important. And when you're sitting in that threshold where that human design brings you to of, I know who I'm not, but I don't really know who I am, because the brain and the body are so flippin' effective, we get into that threshold. And when we hit our first challenge, like we go home for Thanksgiving, that's usually the first challenge, right?
Yeah.
Table, and all of a sudden you go back to default, right? You lose that sovereignty over your own narrative. And so what I did was I actually took all of the vocabulary in traditional human design. I took it into a lab, a sound lab. We did cymatics evaluations and evaluated all of the language and intentionally wrote a new version of human design that had high quality, high frequency language, and really added it to traditional human design. You need both. You need to know who you're not. You need to know, where did my story come from? But you also have to have a goal for, okay, now that I know who I'm not, who am I going to grow into becoming? And how do I, in a very systematic way, look at my story and consciously craft a story, literally using storytelling? How do I tell a better story about who I am so that I can start to really build the infrastructure for growth and evolution in my own life?
That's incredible. And I love that you took something and you were like, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's something really great here. And there's something more. There's something more possible for people. And I love that language piece. And that's something I talk a lot about too, is energy, or words have energy.
Mm-hmm.
And varying words have higher frequencies than others. So I love that you kind of came in and were like, what can we change this to have a higher frequency word or phrase or things like that? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how did you know? Like,
Here, hang on. So this is my best friend. This is Rodale's thesaurus. I literally took every vocabulary word in the human design system and pulled out all the synonyms from the thesaurus. And we went in and we tested. I spoke into a microphone and we tested, like, what's the best What's the highest potential languaging we can use around this archetype? So
So
that
that's incredible. So you have a machine of sorts or a program that tells you the frequency of like words?
I don't, but I have friends who are cymatic experts, and so we did this in a cymatics lab. Yeah.
That's so cool. I didn't even know that existed. That's
Yeah.
that's really cool. So you really tested that out to make sure that this was going to feel congruent.
Mhm.
And one of the things I know that you've talked about is this idea of self-actualization and taking these things to bring people to not only get unstuck, but bring them to a space where they're actually like living their potential or living their dream life. So how does this do that? What kinds of things do people learn about themselves as they're going through and finding their chart for quantum human design? And like, just can you talk a little bit more about like how do people move from being unstuck to having their highest potential?
There's really two parts of that equation. And the first part is, again, standing that threshold of, okay, I know who I'm not. I kind of have a beginning vague idea of who I am. Part one is we start literally using creative writing processes to start looking at who do I want to grow into becoming. And some of that involves looking at what story am I telling now? If I'm really honest about myself and I'm dialed in, part of what we have to do is we also have to get back into the body. That's also part of what happens in that threshold, because when we habitually learn to disassociate from our authentic self, and I always think about it, it starts very early, right? You go to kindergarten, it's a beautiful spring day outside, you're sitting in the classroom in this horribly hard, uncomfortable chair looking out the window and watching the swings blowing in the breeze, and you're like, we should go outside, and the teacher's like, nope, sit down, you need to be quiet, practice your ABCs. In order to survive and not go stark raving mad, we have to check out of the body. And that that removes us oftentimes from an essential component of our decision making capacity, right? We tend to go up here and use logic and reasoning, which absolutely has its place. I'm a scientist, right? It absolutely has its place. And also sometimes it also causes us to really tune out those other intuitive aspects of ourselves that are core in making good, aligned and healthy decisions for our authentic self. So we have to get us back into the body. We have to get us back into the feeling nature of our decision making capacity. And in human design, depending on how your chart is configured, you get your own sort of unique prescription for how to get back into the body and how to really feel your way into what does right feel like in my body and what does wrong feel like in my body. That's an essential part. And then in step two, using that creative writing process, we literally begin to write out through a template, a hero's journey template, write out, okay, what's next in the story. And I think what's so beautiful about using human design, and obviously I love human design, but you don't have to do this with human design. You can do this just straight up without any system, but human design does kind of give you this very systematic way of looking at every layer in the story. You start to pull out, based on your chart, what are the archetypes that I am designed to really grow through over the span of my life? What are the core themes in my story? So I'll give you an example of sort of how that might look. In human design, in every layer of the story, there's always a hermit theme. Some people have a hermit theme in their chart. Now, if we look at hermit as an archetype, in the shadow might be, in our cultural storytelling, that's the wicked witch in the woods who eats, the gingerbread house and who eats, right? That's one
Yep.
aspect. Or Boo Radley in the story, right? To Kill a Mockingbird, the recluse that lives next door.
Sure.
These are sort of, shadow elements of hermit. Hermit shadow energy can also be, in the more modern sense, let's say a new mama. And let's say she has a baby and she has no family close by and she's relatively unsupported, and now she's home alone with this baby and she's just completely touched out and she has no self-care and no alone time for a renewal, right? That's also a shadow aspect of the hermit. So we start our story sort of, where are you in the shadow aspects of these parts of your chart? And if you are going to transform those shadow aspects, if you're going to go through some kind of challenge or growth that's going to evolve your story into the higher expression, where the higher expression of the hermit might be, the baseline might be, okay, I'm somebody who needs time alone. I'm an introvert, right? I need renewal in my alone time. The higher expression might even become, I'm a person who needs alone time to integrate. And that when I take that space to integrate and self renew, then I become and I have access to resources then that I can give others because I'm fully resourced. And that becomes the higher expression of that hermit energy. So we go from, the wicked witch in the woods to becoming somebody who gets called out into service once they've integrated and filled their own tank.
I love that. And I love that there's a sort of that hero story of, moving from, where somebody might have seen it as a negative thing about themselves, or, yeah, I
Mm.
know this is my shadow, or, and it gives them another take on it of like, yeah, that's maybe where one part of you has been, but now we're moving into something where you can use that for greater, to really create something from that. And I imagine you've seen people have really amazing results from this. What kinds of things have you seen where people maybe came to you with one thing or started taking one of your courses and have transformed out of that stuck space? Have you had experiences where, people are like, oh my goodness, now I'm living this life that I didn't even know was possible?
We've had, I mean, if we've had some pretty fun success stories. I'll say my favorite one is I had a woman who was married. She was in her late 30s, actually early 40s, and had been struggling with infertility and had gone through several rounds of IVF and just had not had any success. And we went through the storytelling process. And in her story, in her chart, she had a lot of themes around personal empowerment and feeling disempowered. And she came into our narrative. Plus, she had a lot of ancestral wounding around being an African American woman, and so she had a lot of this big story coming in. And we worked with the story lab process, and we went in, or she went in, and said, "Okay, if I'm going to emerge in as the hero in my story, the heroine in my story, and take back my power, and take back, my connection to my own." Feminine energy, my own feminine power. How would that story look? And she did all of this work and rewrote that narrative. And within 2 months of finishing that process, she became pregnant. And we always joke that this is our quantum alignment system baby. We have weekly updates on our 4-year-old quantum alignment system baby now. But definitely, I've seen people make some huge shifts on the physical level. I've had clients that have come in that have been stuck in grief after the loss of a child, who have really reworked the story so that loss becomes, I don't want to say it becomes a gift, because I don't want to minimize that, but it's certainly, they've taken that narrative and turned it into, this is what I'm here to give back to the world now that I've gone through the arc of this journey. So it can be a really powerful story. Part of what happens is, when we go through stories or we go through experiences, and oftentimes even in our, I think this usually happens at our late teens or early 20s, we tend to stop the evolution of the story at the disruption point or at the catalyst point, and then we make an identity around that. And when we do that, we almost ignore the redemption arc of what happened after. And so some of what we're doing too is bringing us back to, okay, let's go back to the cataclysmic point. Let's explore it, and let's look at it through the lens of, if this story wasn't the end of the story where you kind of ended it, but rather this event is a catalyst for your growth. It is a source of some kind of blessing. And that's not bypassing. Obviously, you don't want to do this in the acute phase of a trauma, but if you can go back and revisit it later, if you're stuck in it, or if you could rewrite the story in such a way that you're actually not a victim of it anymore, how would this story change the redemption arc and where you are right now? And just really rephrasing and re-examining that perspective really moves people forward out of identities that we cultivate at the time for protection and for safety. But again, because our brain is so efficient and our nervous system is so efficient, we get stuck there, and we get stuck in reactive patterns where we're reacting out that protective, whatever that protective identity is. And we have to kind of work to get that identity to reframe its perspective and move on and go through the redemption arc of what happened next.
That's really beautiful. And I think you're absolutely right, is that people get really stuck in that story or the victim space, or, this is this horrible thing that happened. And they don't ever get to really move beyond that or look at the whole picture. And I love that what you're providing is a rewriting of the story and a different perspective of, what's already occurred. I'm curious, so much of the wellness industry and the coaching industry and a lot of things sort of promise, everything will change with you do with this one thing. And, this sounds like this isn't necessarily a quick fix.
No.
Can you talk a little bit about that and like why this is different than like a here's how you fix all your problems tomorrow kind of thing?
I hate that consciousness. I don't know if it's because of my generation or what, but I'm really not from a hack generation. And
Yeah.
I keep bumping up against, the people who support me on my team. And I'm like, I know it's not sexy, but there's no work around the work. There's no work.
Yeah.
And your story, unless you're dead, your story is evolving. And so, who you are today and who you choose to be today might be somebody completely different tomorrow. And so really what I am wanting to teach people is not so much who are you and how do you lock into this new identity, because I mean, I'm 60. I can't, I'm a new person every hour, right?
Absolutely.
And I think really what I want to teach people is how do you approach challenges and not get stuck in them, and not not get so stuck in them that you can't grow beyond the challenge. I think that's, your title for your show is Wild Enthusiasm for Living. When we don't know how to navigate those challenges and start to see them as adventures, which I realize, again, I want to be really clear. Obviously, when you're in the acute phase of a trauma, I'm not saying, la, 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 just write a story about it, right? It's not that easy.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, we live in a culture that has normalized and to a certain degree celebrates survival consciousness. And I'm not a fan of survival consciousness. If you really think about survival, that's like the bare minimum, right? I lived, woo, good. Now what, right? It's like,
Yeah.
we have to start looking at now what? And we are locked into defining ourselves as survivors. And to a certain degree, well, and let me just say, when we lock ourselves into a survival identity, what we end up seeing through the way we're conditioning our thinking is we start to see life as this huge challenge that we survive on a daily basis. And that's exhausting. That's exhausting. And when we can start to go, okay, I'm having this experience. It's a catalytic experience. It's challenging. I'm in the thick of it right now. And I also know that for whatever reason, and I might not be able to see it right now, but I'm going to stay curious. For whatever reason, there's something in here for me. There's something in this experience that is for my growth. It's for my evolution. Maybe there's a reflection in this experience for me to look at, because someplace inside of me, I'm still living out of alignment with my lovability or my self-worth or my courage or anything else related to my resilience. And this is just a reflection showing me what else I might need to change and grow. Because if we don't take back control over our growth process and over our story, then we are vulnerable to getting stuck in those catalytic points. And our culture, again, we're in love with survival consciousness. We're also really in love with victim consciousness.
You
I'm
bet.
honest. And victim is a one down position, and it also makes you very vulnerable to being controlled and bitter and blaming. And I think, if we really look at what's happening in our society right now, so much of that is, I think, an amplified, out of control victim consciousness where, we're all pitted against each other and blaming each other instead of stepping back and going, okay, where do I need to look at taking back sovereignty for myself, for my family, for my community, and how can I do this in a way that is healthy and empowering?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love what you said about all of that. And, I look at, that victim consciousness thing that is so prevalent. I'm a psychologist. It shows up in my office every day, and so, it's one of the things I really work with people on is moving through that. And I love what you said too about just getting beyond survival. Survival, I always tell people survival is baseline or a little below baseline. I'm really looking at, when working with people of, encouraging them to go beyond just like, okay, I'm back to like baseline of things don't suck as much as they sucked last week, but actually like, okay, what can I actually create with my life to thrive and to love every moment as you're evolving and as you're changing? So I really I love that that is where you're taking people and pulling people beyond their like, okay, well, I don't hate everything now, as though that's enough, into something so much greater of like, hey, like your life can change in every moment, but always be evolving and really focusing on strength. So strength and thrival and like love and joy and having a great life, right? So there's so much to that.
And so much of that is, again, going back to the redemption arc. I always tell my students, I'm so grateful I got divorced, and it was hard. My first husband was not part of my kids' lives at all. I got no financial support. It was so hard, but I wouldn't be here now if I hadn't had that experience. And I'm so grateful. I feel like on a certain level, getting sort of cosmic with it, on a soul level, we had an agreement for this, whatever this
Absolutely.
thing was. And that agreement really was responsible for my own growth. I'm grateful for the challenges that I've had, because they've forged the person that I've become, and they've taught me how to appreciate, even the challenges, as much as I don't want to some days. And that's obviously, that's my personal story. And again, I always want to be super mindful. I've had a very relatively blessed life and have not faced major traumas and war and some of the things that some of us are experiencing. And I also feel like we have an obligation, those of us who are not in that position of great suffering, to take back control of our narrative, because I really believe that a high quality narrative is contagious.
Yes.
When you bring that energy into a room, and you're working, let's say you're in a group, let's say you're on a curriculum committee at your kid's school, right? And you walk into that room and you're in that space where you're thriving, and the energy in the room gets quagmired on, do we do algebra 2 or do we do geometry? And you walk in, all of a sudden you bring with you the energy of possibility. If you don't say anything, you kind of bring a different presence into the space. And again, I would say probably now more than ever on this planet, those of us who are in positions of privilege need to be standing in sovereignty over our narrative and bringing that energy into the room, because I think it's going to be one of the only things we can do to break out of this polarized perspective that we have. That's really just, again, victim consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, the way you show up in the world and when you're feeling good and you're functioning from a high frequency, that is contagious. And if you're functioning from a low frequency, that's contagious too. So, so what do you want to show up in the world as? And how do you create to the greater good by really thriving in your own world, in your own life, and then by having that high energy that permeates out into the ether around you and everybody that comes in contact with you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if somebody's brand new to this conversation and they've never heard about human design before, and now that we've sparked some curiosity in them, where might they start to learn more about human design, to learn more about quantum human design? Where does somebody who's fresh to all of this, where might they start?
Well, I would say go to quantumhumandesign.com and bring with you your birthday, your birth time, and birthplace, because on our website, we actually have a little form where you can fill it out and generate your human design chart, which is going to start you in the process of really looking at who's the main character in my story, what are the gifts and strengths of my main character, how do I process and experience energy, how do I get myself back into an embodied state of who I am, and then what's next, right? What's next in that story?
Wonderful. So they can go and get their chart. And then do you offer courses, or I know you have a new book out. Awesome.
I do.
Also, called Quantum Wellness. Is that right?
Quantum Wellness, this book, this is probably be my step 2. Get your chart and then get Quantum Wellness, and get it with the awareness that this isn't a weekend read. This is going to take you a couple of weeks to really sit down and go through the layers in your story part by part and piece by piece, and do that work of getting in there and actually rewriting the story. I actually, in the book, there are all kinds of templates and processes that you can use to start looking at, how do I evolve my main character? What is the healing path for me? What are the sacred flaws that are part of my growth process, that when I understand these and when I encounter these, I can use these as catalysts to push against, so that I move from surviving to thriving, and really use this as a dedicated self-curriculum, if you will.
That's incredible. I love that you offer that in your book. And then moving forward, you have courses and different things that people can learn more.
We do. We actually have, if you go to quantumhumandesign.com, we have what we call essential courses, which are introductory courses for anyone who just wants to go deeper into understanding their chart. We also have a page of practitioners if you want to go get a private reading and an assessment of your chart. And then we do professional training for coaches and therapists and anybody who's in the helping fields to learn how to really assess and see your clients more clearly and more authentically.
That's amazing. I love that you've created this and that you are committed to, creating a greater world with these tools that you have birthed into the universe. I just think this is so amazing. So, and I love that you have so many offerings for people wherever they're ready to jump in, and whether it's for themselves or professionally and to use with clients. And I think our listeners are all across that spectrum.
Mhm.
So that's wonderful. Is there anything else that you would just like to leave us with, a gem before we end here today?
I would just say, here's an exercise to start with. Draw out a line on a piece of paper and think of that line as being the length of your life. And on that line, just make little hashtags of major events in your life. And then really honestly ask yourself, have I stopped my story at some little mark on this lifeline? And am I still living in a story that's 10 years old that I need to evolve?
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful, and that's such an easy thing to start with, and
Mhm.
then you get some awareness of where you'd like to go next.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on with me here today on my podcast, and, yeah, where can people you've mentioned your website, is there anywhere else that people can find you in the world?
I am on Facebook and Instagram. Just look up Dr. Karen Parker. You'll find me there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for listening, and have an amazing rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome.